Hi everybody. So we're continuing to learn about how animals reproduce. And in the last reproduction section we learnt that there's asexual reproduction and there's sexual reproduction. So in this video we're going to focus on sexual reproduction in animals. Remember, sexual reproduction is when there's two individuals involved and they combine their genetic material together so they have a baby that's half of the genes from the mum and half of the genes from the dad. So the genetic material from a biological male and a biological female combine to make the new child. And this is the way that most animals reproduce, and in particular that humans reproduce, so we'll focus more on sexual reproduction from now on. We briefly learnt about the process called fertilization, and we'll look at that in more detail firstly. So here's a diagram of fertilization happening. So this can happen inside the animal or outside the animal, which we'll learn soon. So sperm are the cells, the sex cells that come from males, biological males, and ova, so the ovum here, they're also called eggs commonly, and they're the female reproductive cell. And fertilization is the process when the sperm and the egg meet. Normally it's only one sperm which fertilizes the egg. So you can see here, this sperm happens to get through the wall of the egg cell, and it's the one that's going to fertilize the egg. The other ones will die and not fertilize it. Once the sperm and the egg have fertilized and we have a fertilized egg, we call that a zygote. A fertilized egg. And then the zygote is ready to multiply and divide and grow into a whole new organism, whether it's a baby human, a baby elephant, or this even happens in plants, and it can grow into a fruit and a seed ready to grow into a new plant. So fertilization is the key for sexual reproduction. And like I mentioned before, it can happen inside the animal or outside the animal. And let's look at those two options. So external fertilization is when the egg and the sperm meet outside the animal. And internal fertilization is obviously when the fertilization happens in the animal. There's a few different groups of animals that tend to do this. So external fertilization tends to happen in sea creatures because the egg and the sperm are free to move around the water in the ocean, or for fish in rivers and freshwater environments as well. So the species that tend to do external fertilization, there's corals, sea stars, sea urchins, fish. And so in external fertilization, the sperm and the egg are just released into the water. And you can see here, the process is called spawning. And here's a whole lot of fish during spawning season, where the sperm and the eggs, millions and millions and millions of cells, are just released out into the water. So all those sperm and all those eggs are released into the ocean. And it's really just about probability. Some of those eggs are going to find a sperm, and occasionally there'll be a couple that meet and fertilization can happen. The vast majority of them are just going to die, but there's enough fertilization happening that there'll be some zygotes, and then they eventually grow into new species, into baby fish or baby corals or whatever species it is. So that's external fertilization. With internal fertilization, it's normally land animals that do internal fertilization. So there's a few examples here: insects and mammals like these little possums, reptiles. They all have internal fertilization. And internal fertilization is essentially breeding, mating, where the male and the female physically need to fertilize the egg. So you can see with these insects here, you might have seen dragonflies flying around like this. They actually mate for a whole day, and they fly around attached while they're mating for at least 12 hours or so. And the sperm get transferred from the male to the female. And the same with possums, and the same with humans as well, us being mammals. So internal fertilization, the sperm gets deposited from the biological male to the female, and then fertilization happens in the female somewhere. Okay, so once that fertilization has happened, then the egg needs to develop. And there's a few different ways that have evolved for the eggs to develop as well. And we're going to split them up into internal and external again. So if the eggs develop externally, that means that the female either lays the eggs or they get released early on, like in sea creatures. So let's have a look at those two. So here's an example of some fish. They have external egg development because they release all their eggs and sperm with external fertilization. So the eggs and the sperm fertilize in the ocean, they grow into tiny little eggs, and then those eggs grow into little fish which hatch in the ocean. And the mother isn't involved at all in that process. She doesn't bring up the young like a human or a mammal does. Reptiles and birds, because don't forget birds are reptiles as well. They evolved from the dinosaurs. So they still breed, they still mate. So fertilization happens in the mother, but then she lays eggs like we know, and then the eggs sit in a nest. They'll either be, and they're normally tended to by the mother, who needs to roost on the nest to keep the eggs warm until they develop. So here's some crocodiles hatching and some birds hatching. So the development of the egg is outside of the mum, but she's still involved with reptiles and birds. With mammals, we have internal development of the egg. So for humans and other mammals, there's the uterus in the female, where the baby develops completely until it's ready to be born. In marsupials, which are another type of animal that we've got in Australia, which are mammals, the egg is born quite early, but it still develops inside the pouch until it's old enough to come out of the pouch and be ready to walk around. So we call those internal development because the baby develops inside the mum. Okay, so that's the overview of how sexual reproduction works in animals.